Well, hey, everybody, I'm Sam. I am a student of the Bible and I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 22 years and I have a pretty good, okay grasp, I guess, on biblical languages, and I'm a writer also. Um, and so I want to jump in. I talked about Genesis 1 last week. I want to jump into Genesis chapter 2 today, and I want to talk about a question that pops up a lot. And the question is this: why does Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, why do they seem so different from each other? Why does it seem like they're two completely different stories? Are these contradictions with each other? Can they be kind of, put together in some way? And actually, the answer to this question, there's actually two different answers to the question. There is what I would call, I don't know if this is the actual name for it or not, but what I would call the explanation theory of this, and then there is what is called the documentary hypothesis that's on the other side. So on one side of the equation, you have what I call the explanation theory, which is that Genesis 2 is a more detailed, historical, accurate, whatever you want to call, explanation of creation, and Genesis 1 is more like the prologue to the story, kind of a deal. And so the people who would ascribe to this would say that Moses was the author of Genesis, and that he was writing Genesis chapter 1 as more of a prologue, like this is the creation account in general, and then Genesis chapter 2 is more of a detailed explanation of how it actually kind of happened. Some people who are way fundamentalist, literalist readers of the Bible here would say that no, that's not even it. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 line up perfectly together. In our Bibles, though, for the most part, we have mistranslations of the Hebrew here. And so we need to read it a certain way to make it fit and make sense. And actually, in the NIV, it seems that the editors of the NIV and the translators of the NIV want to try to do this. And so I think that's fascinating. For the most part, I love the NIV, but this is very interesting. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 8 and verse 19 are some of the verses in question, because they read like this. They read, "Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east." And that "had" there is important to the argument, the theological argument that no, these do not differ from each other, these two accounts. This is like a past thing. Like God created mankind, because here's the discrepancy. In Genesis chapter 1, it's laid out like we've talked about. Day 1, there's light and dark. Day 2, sky and sea. Day 3, there's the dry ground and the plants and vegetation. Day 4 is the sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. Day 6, the wild animals, and then mankind. And then day 7, God rests. That's Genesis 1. Genesis chapter 2 starts out very different. Genesis 1 starts out saying the earth was formless and empty. It was this chaotic, wasteland, water-covered planet. Genesis chapter 2 says, well, the earth was a giant dust ball. It's like just this big, dusty, dirty thing with some dew on the ground that made it muddy. And so God reaches down into the mud, forms the first human being, and then plants a garden, and then puts the man in the garden, and then realizes, oh no, he's all alone by himself. He's been tending the garden. That's great, but he needs a helper suitable to him, is what the text says. And so God goes back out to the dust ball, and he forms animals, brings them in to see if these are going to be the helpers suitable for the Adam, the man, and they're not. And so God realizes, oh, what I need to do is I need to take from man to create his helper. And so he creates a woman from man. That's the whole story of Genesis 2. So these are very different accounts. And so the question is, okay, how do you reconcile those two, right? And so the literalist who says, no, these have to agree 100%, not even the like prologue versus the explanation. The literalist would say, no, it has to be translated "had" in verse 8 and "had" in verse 19. And now the Lord God had planted in the past to make it make sense with Genesis 1. Genesis 2:19, now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all of the animals to make it make sense with Genesis 1. Here's the issue, though. In the Hebrew text, that's not the way it reads. And I'm going to take you right there, right now, so you can see. This is chapter 2, verse 8, and then we'll go to verse 19, pulled up on Bible Hub in the Hebrew right here. So here's what I wanted to point out, because the NIV translates these verses, especially verse 8, it says, now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east. And this is the way that people want to say, hey, look, this does not contradict Genesis 1. It does not even remotely. It works. We can make all this work together by using the had as the anterior, going, look, God made all this before he created human beings, so look, it works. Here's what I want to point out, though. Check this right out here. So, vayita right here, this word, and planted, is the word in question in verse 8 of Genesis chapter 2. So it says, vayita Yahweh Elohim gan. And it means, and planted Yahweh God a garden. Now, here's the deal. If this was going to be translated, had planted, then this word would look different. There would be a simple va and a schwa there, and what you would have, you would have the conjunctive vav, but you would have it in the pluperfect here, and not in the call consecutive imperfect. Okay, the pluperfect demonstrates anteriority. The pluperfect says go backwards, or this was in the past, had planted, but this word here, this verb here, is in the consecutive imperfect, meaning this is pointing forward. This is pointing towards something that is continuing to happen, that happened next in the story. And the fact that there's a conjunctive vav and a consecutive imperfect here means that the vav is working in a consecutive thing to say this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Let's go to verse 19. This is the other verse in question, where in the NIV, and then in some people's minds, how you should translate this. It says, now the Lord God had formed out of the ground wild animals. To say, well, look, the animals came before man, right? But here's how it reads right here in the Hebrew. It says, Vayisar, Yahweh Elohim min, Hadamah. So you have Vayisar here, and formed, and look, it's the same. The conjunctive vav used as a consecutive, and it's in the call, and it's also in the consecutive imperfect once again, not in the pluperfect. Pluperfect, interiority, go backwards, had formed. Consecutive imperfect, continuation, and formed. So this is important to understand, and a lot of people who don't understand Hebrew don't understand how this is constructed and want to try to read into the text something that's not there to make it fit, and it just isn't there. So the text should read in a consecutive order, that there was the God of the universe, this Yahweh Elohim, Lord God, went down to the dust ball of the earth, created the man, and then planted the garden, then placed the man in the garden, and then realized there was a problem, that he was alone, and so then went back out to the dust ball, created animals, and then brought the animals to the man to name and to figure out if this is the helper for him. Okay, so that's the Hebrew that's going on here, and so that means something. It means that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are different creation accounts, and so the question is it an explanation of a more factual account in Genesis 2 that in Genesis 1 is more of an overview? Or are these two separate accounts written at two separate times? Let's talk about that. All right, so what's going on here? If the word had isn't there, then we can't have a looking to the past, that God did this in the past. This is a going forward thing. So these seem like two very different accounts. So how do you account for that? Well, there is, like I said, the explanation that Moses is the one who wrote it. He wrote Genesis 1 as a prologue, and Genesis 2 is the actual kind of creation account. But then there's also the documentary hypothesis. And most biblical scholars will go with some form of the documentary hypothesis. And this has been around since the 1900s. And basically what it says is that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, were actually stitched together using 4 different sources, sometimes 3 different sources. But originally it was the priestly source, the Elohist source, the Yahwist source, and the Deuteronomy source, or the Deuteromistic source. And those were the 4 that accounted for the Torah. And mostly the book of Genesis is a combination of the priestly source and the Elohist and Yahwist sources. And so what we have going on here, according to biblical scholars, is we have in the documentary hypothesis is that Genesis chapter 2, 3, and 4 are some combination of the Yahwist and Elohist source, and I'll talk about why that is. And then Genesis chapter 1 is actually a part of a different source altogether, the priestly source. And the way the documentary hypothesis states this is that Genesis 2, 3, and 4 may have actually been the original creation story, the story of the fall of mankind, and the story of Adam and Eve's kids. That was originally there. And it was the Elohist and Yahwist sources. And the reason they say that is because it seems like the original account. It seems as though this was written earlier. And the way that they talk about God goes from being Elohim in Genesis chapter 1 to being Yahweh Elohim in Genesis 2, 3, and 4. And so it's translated in our Bibles, God in Genesis chapter 1 and Lord God in Genesis chapter 2, 3, and 4. And so the documentary hypothesis says, well, this may have been the original account, and it was written from these two sources. And then during the exile, or maybe even after the exile, the priestly account came about because as kind of like a corrective to Genesis 2, 3, and 4, or as like an added like document, like, oh, hey, by the way, we don't really love the way God's portrayed in Genesis 2, 3, and 4, so we're going to portray him as the Most High God, Elohim, who has this huge ability to take the wasteland that there is and create it into something that is, the Hebrew word is tov, or that is, good and very good. So that's the way the documentary hypothesis talks about this, is that Elohim, the Most High God, the strong God, the mighty God, that's the way we want to present it. And so they came in and added that, as according to the documentary hypothesis, added that on the front end in Genesis chapter 1 to sit side by side with Genesis chapter 2, which doesn't seem to portray God in a very good light. It's like he messed up a bunch in the creation. And they said, okay, we're going to have these two sit side by side. Now, the question is, okay, so why were the compilers, the editors, the author, why were they okay, if this is the true thing, why were they okay with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 sitting side by side, contradicting each other like that? And the answer is because they're not very concerned with, does this line up with historical fact? They're not really concerned with, is this like science and accurate and all that. What they're concerned about most is, what do these say about God? What's the theological purpose that we're gleaning from this? What does that say about the God of this universe who created? And then what does it say about you and me, his creation? Okay, so when we are exploring the texts of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 and 4, the questions that we should be asking ourselves are those questions, the theological questions, the questions of who is God? Who is this creator? Who are we as his creation? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? What does it mean that we disobeyed God and fell? Like, we should be asking those questions, and that seems to be the questions that the text wants to address. And the questions that we should not be asking of this text are questions that revolve around history and science and that kind of stuff when it comes to this, okay? Because that's the way the ancient Near Eastern mind worked. They presented the theological over the historical and the scientific all the time. It wasn't until the Enlightenment and all that we got even interested in making sure everything was like fact-checked and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, so Genesis 1 and 2, here's the question then is like, well, which one of these is true? I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. Both sides of this argument want to present themselves as being accurate, being true. Here's what I do know. I do know that we can't go into Genesis 2 and read the word had in the pluperfect to mean anteriority, meaning that we can kind of try to make this make sense with Genesis 1 and 2. We have to be okay with these two creation accounts sitting side by side, and either one explaining in more detail and better detail and more accurate detail the other one, or they're just two different ones and they sit side by side with each other, and we have to be okay with the tension, because as I've discovered, and as a lot of us have discovered, sometimes the best, the most real truth sits in the tension. All right, so hopefully that was interesting and helpful for you as you're reading Genesis 1 and 2, and maybe have some of these questions popping up. All right, thanks for hanging out with me. If you haven't yet, like, subscribe, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video.